Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm so proud to be standing alongside not just colleagues, but friends. Representative Chris Deluzio. We may be joined in a bit by Representative Raul Ruiz and the president of Athena Strategies and former Pennsylvania Secretary of State, Kathy Boockvar. Yesterday marked 6 weeks until the November 5th election. And already, administratively, we see some states mailing out vote-by-mail ballots. We see some states opening in-person early voting locations. The election's happening. And while not all of our colleagues share the same, political thinking and positions and priorities when it comes to policy, one thing that we should all be able to agree on is that all eligible Americans should be able to participate in this election freely and easily, without unnecessary obstacles or barriers to the ballot box. Now, during my time as Chief Elections Officer in the state of California, when I served as California Secretary of State, I took pride in advancing a number of reforms that made it easier and more secure for eligible citizens to register to vote, to stay registered to vote, and to cast their ballot. But sadly, election administration in the year 2024 also means being concerned about protecting voters and protecting election workers from harassment and threats of violence. And sadly, there's a long, dark history of voter suppression and intimidation in our country. Well-documented scare tactics intended to deny the vote or discourage or even scare Americans away from the polls. And we know that in this day and age, there's individuals out there stoked by partisan rhetoric and false narratives about election fraud that have taken it upon themselves to either discourage at a minimum or sometimes outright intimidate people into not letting their voice be heard in the democratic process. And there's a well-documented rise in threats to election workers and election volunteers. Nearly 40% of election workers have reported experiencing threats, harassment, or some other type of abuse. And the sad reality of both political violence and gun violence this year means folks are genuinely worried about their safety. So today, we're saying something simple. In no place in America should a fear of violence prevent somebody from being able to cast their vote. And no election worker should have to fear for their safety or for their life in helping us administer the fundamental process of democracy that we call elections. So we are introducing a bill that will protect Americans from armed antagonists carrying visible firearms at election centers, and it would protect not just voters, but election workers from those who hope to affect the administration in a negative way, the administration of our elections. I'm proud to say that just last night, Governor Gavin Newsom in my home state of California signed a state law to provide these protections to election workers and voters in California. But I firmly believe that these protections should be in place for all voters nationwide. At this moment, we need to lower the temperature on political rhetoric and make sure that all Americans feel safe enough to participate in our democracy. By eliminating the fears of violence from election centers, we will be doing exactly that. And I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join us in this effort. Before I turn it over to Representative Deluzio, I would like to offer a few words in Spanish for Spanish language media that's here today. Estamos reunidos hoy para presentar un nuevo proyecto de ley que prohibirá gente con armas visibles en los centros de votaciones en los Estados Unidos. Sabemos que hay una historia muy triste de violencia política en el país y esfuerzos para prevenir que votantes elegibles participen en las elecciones cuando hay un interés de un partido contra otro. en el ambiente que estamos viviendo actualmente, el nivel de temor que existe en algunas comunidades, a las amenazas que estamos viendo, el resultado de retórica política de disque líderes políticos en el Partido Republicano, lo mínimo que podemos hacer es asegurar el ambiente electoral, no solo para votantes, sino para los trabajadores que administran las elecciones también. Hemos visto un número récord de amenazas contra los trabajadores de las elecciones y ellos merecen mejor. Es mi orgullo trabajar en colaboración con mi colega, el representante Chris Deluzio del estado de Pennsylvania. Please welcome my colleague, my friend, and the best catcher on the congressional baseball team, Representative Chris Deluzio.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Senator Padilla. I appreciate the baseball team remarks. He's got a nice fastball himself. Has been a great leader on election security. It's important to have the voice of someone who really has been in the trenches doing that work as a Secretary of State in California. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here to mark the introduction of an important bill, the Freedom from Intimidation in Elections Act. Protecting our democracy is an issue near and dear to me, and I know so many others. I served the country in uniform and later worked as a lawyer to protect our elections at Pitt Cyber and at the Brennan Center for Justice. Of course, I want to thank Senator Padilla and also Senator Murphy for their support for the bill and recognize my House co-lead, Congressman Raul Ruiz from California. Dr. Ruiz has been a champion for election security and for voting rights throughout his time in Congress, and the bill we're all introducing today is the newest chapter of his work to make polling places safer for voters and for election workers, and we appreciate his support. I also want to recognize my former colleague, Sean Morales Doyle, from the Brennan Center, and Pennsylvania's former Secretary of the Commonwealth, Kathy Bokar, for joining us today. The right to vote is foundational to our democracy. To protect that right, we must keep polling places and official ballot drop-off sites free from intimidation. With the risk that's rising of political violence and ongoing attacks on our democracy, it's clear we need action to strengthen the sanctity of our elections. The Freedom from Intimidation in Elections Act of 2024 would help protect the rights of America's voters and election workers so they can vote and perform their important official duties free from intentional intimidation and threats of violence. Election security, of course, means safe and secure voter rolls, resilient voting systems, and strong cyber defenses. But it also means making sure that our polls are places where voters are safe and places where election workers can fulfill their duties. Across the country in recent years, we've seen people use intimidation tactics to try and interrupt the electoral process. I'll share a photo of two armed people dressed in tactical gear that surveilled a ballot drop box in Mesa, Arizona in 2022. This has unfortunately become too common. I'll tell you, I served in a war zone. Our polls should never feel like one. I'm proud to introduce this bill today alongside fellow election security advocates to update existing anti-intimidation provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These updates will help limit the presence of visible firearms at locations where voters cast their ballots or where election workers perform their official duties. It will also provide a legal path for people who experience this type of intimidation, including an emergency civil, non-criminal injunction that would allow the voter or election official to carry out their official duties. Our government of, by, and for the people depends on our foundational right to vote. The recent lies around stolen elections and false claims of voter fraud have made things worse. The rhetoric has made things worse. And the prevalence of political violence is stressing our elections and stressing our democracy. With bills like ours, we can help protect the security of our elections, and in doing so, also protect the foundational principles of our great nation. It's something that all freedom-loving Americans of every party should agree on and should stand for. I'm hopeful we can get this thing done with support in the Senate and the House. I want to introduce Sean Morales Doyle from the Brennan Center for Justice. Sean serves as the director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights Program. He advocates for pro-voter reforms like automatic voter registration while fighting back in the courts against voter suppression efforts. Sean's a seasoned litigator with experience in civil rights and constitutional matters, with a background in labor and employment law, and unfortunately is a Chicago White Sox fan. I'm very sorry. I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Excuse me. Thank you so much to Representative Deluzio and to Senator Padilla. As Representative Deluzio mentioned, we were colleagues at the Brennan Center, and I believe actually started on the same day as Voting Rights Council years ago. So I'm really so proud to be standing here with both Representative Deluzio and Senator Padilla and former Secretary of State Bukfar to talk about this really important legislation. We commend the representatives and senators who are behind this bill for their leadership on voting rights. This policy really is a significant, creative, and impactful policy. It is sort of at the cutting edge of policy to protect our elections from intimidation and from political violence. As Senator Padilla mentioned, just last night, California became the first state in the country with this policy on the books. And so this really would be groundbreaking. At the same time, this is really a policy that proposes changes that everyone should get behind because it represents some really common sense principles. The first one being all voters, all election officials, all election workers should be able to participate and run our democracy free from intimidation. I think we can all agree on that. And the second is that guns, visible guns around our elections are intimidating. That also seems pretty straightforward. On that first point, as has now been mentioned a couple times, the Brennan Center for Justice conducts an annual survey of election officials, and what our survey found this year is sadly that 2 out of 5 election officials report being subject to threats, abuse, or harassment. Just in the last month, election officials in 15 different states received suspicious packages with white powder in them. These are the heroes of our elections. These are people like former Secretary of State Padilla and Bukfar who made sure that we had a safe and secure election in 2020 in unprecedented conditions, that make sure that we have this resilient democracy that continues to function so well in the face of all of these threats. And we owe it to them to protect them from these kinds of threats. And on the second point, the second principle, I think, again, we can all agree that guns have no place near our elections. And sadly, the Brennan Center and the Giffords Law Center put out a report last year called Guns and Voting. We're frankly lacking the legal protections in many states to make sure that guns don't come near our elections. There are only, as of the time we put that report out, there are only 12 states and Washington, D.C. that prohibit both open and concealed carry at polling places. We've done a lot of work on that this year, and so actually that number's come up to 15. We've seen bills pass in New Mexico, Vermont, Colorado, Massachusetts, hopefully later this year in Michigan, in addition to the legislation passed and signed into law in California last night. But that still means there are many states without adequate legal protections against guns around our elections. And so because of those two, sort of changes in the way that our elections run and the increased threat of political violence, I think it's critical that Congress take action to protect all the people who participate in our elections. And what this bill would do is expand upon and improve the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which already includes very strong protection against intimidation of voters and election workers when they're doing their job. What this would do is it would make that protection for election workers explicit, and it would make clear that they are protected even when they are being threatened simply for their status as election workers and election officials, not only when they are doing their job running elections. And it would create a presumption that visible guns around elections when people are interacting with or observing protected conduct, whether that's at polling places or elsewhere, is presumptively intimidating. I want to emphasize that our elections in this country still are, by and large, safe. Most voters are going to go to the polls this year and are going to have a smooth, safe experience. They're not going to experience violence and intimidation. But we want to keep it that way. And with the changes in gun regulation around the country, with the changes in the threat of political violence, and with this unfortunate trend of attacks on election officials and threats of election officials, it's really important that Congress take action now to ensure that we keep our elections safe and peaceful and secure. And so I just really want to thank again Senator Padilla, Representative Deluzio for their work to make sure that that's the case. And I think I'm turning it back to Senator Padilla now.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Turning it back to me because I have the honor of presenting the next and final speaker, a friend from our days as Secretaries of State together. She Kathy Bookvar is the former Secretary of State in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, now serving as president of Athena Strategies, which works to strengthen election security and our democracy. Kathy, let's bring this home.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. I think we're in the afternoon. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here and for giving attention to this really critical bill. I want to thank Senator Padilla. I was so proud to work alongside you when we were both secretaries, and Representative Deluzio. We also got to work together strengthening Pennsylvania's election security. So I want to thank you both for your leadership and dedication on behalf of voters and election officials across the United States. Election Day is about 41 days away, but who's counting? But for the dedicated American workers who make sure that every eligible voter can cast their ballot, this is basically a 365-day-a-year job. And these are some of the hardest working people I know who literally work around the clock, frankly, underpaid, understaffed, overworked, and they are there to make sure every ballot gets sent out on time, that voting systems are tested, that voting systems are, programmed properly, that eligible voters can vote, and that every eligible ballot is counted and then audited, right? We've got lots that are involved in this 365-day-a-year job. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to election officials who work like this tirelessly to make sure every one of us can exercise our fundamental right to vote. And yet it is these same hardworking Americans, instead of being celebrated and given the raises that they so rightly deserve, are under siege. And over the last 4 years, election officials across the country of every partisan stripe in every state have faced unprecedented threats and challenges. I wish I didn't know anything about this, but unfortunately I do. And, immediately following the 2020 election, there was a deliberate effort to intimidate and terrorize election officials. They came in the form of calls, emails, posts on social media. We had our faces in crosshairs. There were organized protests encouraging people to bear arms. Colleagues of ours had, their children facing death threats, right? They had their houses, their private residences surrounded, all because they were election officials, the heroes of our democracy, I think, as Sean so eloquently said it. And, many of us hoped against hope that as each official action happened, as each lawsuit was decided, that things would get better. And, all the upholding of the laws, 2020 turned into 2021, and instead, unfortunately, things have gotten worse. As Sean, mentioned from the Brennan Center's annual reports and surveys of election officials, more election officials are experiencing threats. We've got doxing, we've got swatting, we've got the white powder incidents, we've got the photographs that you mentioned in Arizona. It's just been nonstop. And this has got to stop. This is the kind of behavior that we expect in dictatorships, that we expect in tyrannical, countries, overseas adversaries. This is not who we are. This is not America. So I want to, and it's a danger for all of us, right? It's a danger not just for election officials, but also for voters and for election operations. This bill is a critical part of the solution. As previously expressed, this bill, the Freedom from Intimidation in Elections Act, aims to protect voters and election workers by ensuring that voters, in casting their ballots, and election officials in every part of the process can do their jobs, from the casting of ballots to the counting of the ballots to the canvassing and the certification. Every part of the process is protected. And as mentioned, it also establishes the rebuttable presumption that carrying a visible firearm during those operations violates the law. But I want to be clear that the law also does something that's very important, which is it makes an exception for law enforcement officers carrying out their official duties, because they are our partners in this, in helping make sure that we also protect our election operations. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also point out another key part of the solution here, which is adequate funding of elections. We still don't have that in this country. So I want to say, and this is something that, just like anywhere else, election officials need to be able to budget ahead of time to make sure that every part of our process is secure, is accessible, that we're upgrading outdated systems, that we're protecting against the latest technological threat. And we need funding to do that. So in addition to passing this bill, I'd love to say, I would love the budget, the federal budget. Currently, the Senate's package has $75 million for election security funds. Let's not cut a single dime of that. Let's have that go through. And let's make sure that we have election officials' backs, just like they have ours, and make sure that we're providing those on the front lines of democracy with the support and resources that we all need. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everybody. We'll open up to a couple of questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
By complete coincidence, I'm working on a feature story about the two men arrested at the Philadelphia Convention Center 4 years ago. And they are far from a spent force, I would say, the things they're predicting. Wonder your feelings, 1,500 convictions, only 2 acquittals from January 6th. The top leadership in jail for decades. Do you think they are a spent force, or are they just getting started? What do you fear this time?
As much as I'd like to hope for the best, our responsibility is to prepare for the worst. And between what you shared, the chatter that we know is out there, and the increasingly toxic political rhetoric that has become the norm in this presidential campaign, we have to be ready. We have to be ready. And so this is our addition to a lot of strategies and plans that are being implemented right now. Again, just tapping on my former Secretary of State experience, it wasn't just working with each of the county elections administrators to ensure the timely printing of ballots, distribution of ballots, the ballot counting, auditing, certification process, et cetera, but to ensuring that there are security plans in place for headquarters, for polling places, for ballot drop boxes. The bar continues to be raised.
For this building also? Do you fear or expect either of you another January 6th? Or in state capitol?
So it has been designated, the January 6th of next year has now been designated a national security event. And so security preparations for next January 6th will far exceed what it was for prior days like it. I don't know if you want to add anything, Congressman.
Thank you, Senator. And I'll add, we are doing important work here around legislation and protecting election officials and voters. We can't change or we can't legislate what's in the hearts of candidates. We can't change the fact that the former president has called people convicted of crimes around the January 6th insurrection political prisoners. That lies with that man and others like him who support him. And so we can do our duties here, but I think patriotic Americans across the political spectrum have to be clear about calling out that kind of political rhetoric and the violence it can encourage.
You're ascribing all of this potential to one man? Purely partisan?
I think that he is the principal voice behind what happened on January 6th and the continuing rise of the risk of political violence around those who were involved in January 6th and efforts to lie about the 2020 election falls with him.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator. On so many issues, it's important for the federal government to coordinate with local and state officials. This is one of those issues. Can you speak to the American people about how important it is for the members of Congress to defer and listen to what's going on the ground? Elections are such, all elections are local, they're run at the local level. Can you just speak to how important it is for federal officials to also be coordinating with the state and local officials to make sure that these processes are running effectively, efficiently, and safely?
Right. So, yeah, that's been one of the challenges over the years when there's this tension between, we believe federal government has a big role to play in all aspects of elections, supporting states in their role. Others push back and say, no, states administer elections, federal government stay away. From the lens of the interest of the people, we all got to be working together. And that's why we have things in place like coordination with CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, helping support states in their efforts to ensure election cybersecurity, for example. The Department of Justice has a civil rights division that helps enforce voting rights in the United States of America. And so here we are offering this bill with resources to go along with to support state and local elections administrations officials, because at the end of the day, as we've said before, every eligible American has the right to participate in this democracy without any unnecessary obstacles, barriers, and certainly free of intimidation.
Senador, para Telemundo.
Sí, última pregunta, last question.
Gracias. ¿Qué es lo que más les preocupa en este proceso electoral?
Bueno, más que nada queremos asegurar a los votantes que los que tienen el derecho a votar, los que son elegibles, merecen la oportunidad de inscribirse para votar y votar sin temor de violencia o de intimidad en las casillas de votación. Este proyecto de ley prohibirá las armas visibles en cualquier centro de votación para la protección no solo de los votantes, sino los trabajadores de las elecciones también. Did y'all get that? Thank you all for being here.